Michael is an associate professor of comparative literature and Italian at the University of California, Davis. His work focuses on Italian modernism and its global circularization through translation. He is co-president of the Pirandello Society of America and once again director of California Italian Studies. And without further ado, I'm going to leave the stage to Ann Goldstein and Michael Subialka.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you, and I think I'll start us off just with a couple of brief remarks, just to situate things. And I think you already heard, and I'm sure you're already familiar with the fact that Ann Goldstein is the sort of voice and representative that we have of Elena Ferrante, who is certainly one of the most well-known Italian writers and probably the most well-known contemporary Italian writer here in the United States and abroad, in large part thanks to the amazing work that Anne has done in translating her and making her available to us. For those who don't know, I just want to situate a little bit of what that looks like. Elena Ferrante is a novelist, is most known as a novelist, but she's also written in other genres as well. And her writings started already a couple of decades ago, but have become increasingly famous in the early and mid-2000s, when we had the kind of production of her Neapolitan quartet. So these 4 novels that were based in Naples, and it really capture the experience of these young girls growing up and becoming women, and the kind of social and thank you. Yeah, they had asked me to put together a couple of little slides. Let's see if we can. Oh, there we go. Yes. So the idea here is to think a little bit about how translating Ferrante is also translating Italy, because translating Ferrante has made Italy more available to the sort of cultural imagination of people in the United States and abroad, and has also opened the door, as in fact was discussed at the event last night, to new voices and to new authors who are also reaching new audiences as a result. So I don't know if it's clicking. Are you able, Franca, to click it? Thank you. Yeah, I don't think the clicker is not doing anything. It's okay. We don't need the slides. All you're going to get really is a lot of covers of books and some nice pictures of Naples, and of course that's all very lovely. But at the end of the day, it's not that necessary. So Ferrante has published these 4 novels, the Neapolitan Quartet, and in addition to that, you have a whole host of other writings. Oh, there we go. This is about Ann Goldstein. So as you can see, she grew up in New Jersey. What else have we got? Keep going. And she studied classics at Bennington College, as well as comparative philology at UCL, the University College London, right? So sort of a across the pond education. But one thing I really did want to mention, this is why I actually put together this slide, not just to embarrass Anne, because she's sitting here and talking about her on a timeline here, but precisely because for so many years, she was primarily employed as an editor at The New Yorker, right? Of course, one of the most important cultural magazines in the United States. And she was an editor at The New Yorker during the time that she learned Italian, began translating Italian, and then became the most sort of prolific and important translation voice of Italian for our contemporary generation. And so this is the thing I want to talk to her a little about, and give her a chance to talk to you about, is the kind of complexity of balancing all these roles and how they fit together, because I think there's a lot to probably say there, which is really interesting. We can keep going, thank you. So she's, yeah, as I said, in the 1990s, she started translating from Italian, but it was sort of later when she started working on Ferrante that she, there we go, so Ferrante translations began for Europa editions in 2004. So not with the most famous novels, the Neapolitan Quartet, but with some of Ferrante's earlier works. And in fact, this was her second novel, which was the first one translated into English, and then you went and translated the first one. There we go, yeah. So then we have the Neapolitan novels in that period between 2012 and 2015, and At the same time, she was working on all of these other projects, though. So we might associate her with Ferrante. I've been talking about Ferrante this whole time, but in fact, she's been the voice and the translator for so many important writers. For example, Primo Levi, who is a fundamental voice of 20th century Italian writing, and whose works she not only translated, but also edited the complete collection of, right? A project that must have taken, as we said,
10 or 11 years.
10 or 11 years.
It was a major project.
Yeah.
So was Ferrante.
Well, exactly. So I want to give people a picture of how many things are going on simultaneously here and all the other projects involved. I also want to give just a little bit of background on Ferrante for those who maybe are familiar with her writing, but not as familiar with her. There we go. This one doesn't have to go all at once, or it can go all at once, that's easier. So we don't know a lot about Ferrante's life, of course, because famously she is anonymous. Right, so what we know would come from interviews, some of her own writings and essays, but she's also very reticent about giving interviews, which are always done by writing. People don't meet her, right? And in fact, she talks about that in one of the collections that you translated. Do I put that up here? Oh, there it is. Oh, it's awkwardly broken between a couple of lines, but the Frantumaglio, which is a collection of letters that kind of chronicle her own process of becoming Ferrante, as we know her, this kind of figure. So there's speculation about her background, but her debut novel was from 1992, L'amore molesto, Troubling Love, which was not the first one that Anne translated to English. The first one she translated to English was actually from a decade later, I giorni dell'abbandono, the days of abandonment. And then its success, I think, must have led to, was that the kind of process?
The success of the Days of Abandonment?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a little bit more complicated because it was the first book published by Europa Editions, which was this Italian publisher, Edizioni AO, had this idea that they wanted to publish in English. And so they decided that they had published Ferrante in Italy, and they decided to publish that would their first book in America, in English, I should say, would be The Days of Abandonment. And I think that it was pretty successful, in fact. But nothing like the Neapolitan novels, but it certainly led to other, I think they probably all along intended to translate all of Ferrante, but nobody expected, well, I'm kind of getting ahead of the story.
We all know where it's going.
Right, in the meantime, they published a lot of other translations and also original books in English. But the Edizioni AO had published a lot of translations from Eastern Europe, so they were into publishing translations, which at that time wasn't quite, it's gotten a little better now, but at the time, it wasn't something that a lot of publishers were doing.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting, right? This story, you see another example of how the success of one thing can open doors for further things, right?
Well, yeah, there was a big, with the publication of Ferrante, the success of the Neapolitan novels, a lot of other women writers were translated, both women writers earlier in the 20th century and current writers. It made more space for them certainly in translated literature, but I think also in Italy.
Yeah, it's such an important role. And in fact, in the next slide, I think that's the same slide, right? There we go. Yes, so these are in fact all of the books that, I think I got them all, but you can tell me if I've left anything out. As you can see, there are a lot of them, right? And we go across novels and different writings. Did I get them all?
I think so.
Going all the way up until 2022, which I'm covering up, sorry. But as you can see, right, we have this kind of long sort of trajectory of bringing so many different works of Ferrante's into the public view here in the United States and abroad. And the next slide, I think, yes, of course, these are the most famous, right? So we have the 4 Neapolitan novels and the 4 translations, which I think you'll have to click to make them come down. So I'm sorry to make you do all this. I was supposed to be, there we go. And all the translations, which Notably, you'll see have something absent on them, which is also an interesting thing to note, right? Which is, of course, the translator's name, which is not on the cover of the translations, which is very common practice for a lot of presses. But despite that, I think Ann Goldstein's name has become so well known to people because of her role as the voice for Ferrante and the sort of prolific nature of all this translation. And it's also opened up doors for other translators as well. So I think that maybe at this point we'll just go ahead and leave the slides behind and we can start talking with Ann about this work, translating Ferrante and translating so many other authors, and get a chance to give her the real voice now and tell us a little bit about what's going on there. So I want to kind of start off with a question for you, just about how you got into translation and what drew you into this as something that you wanted to do in general, and then Italian as the language you wanted to work with in particular.
Well, I think that all translators have a kind of accidental becoming a translator accidentally story, which is mine. But I had wanted to learn Italian since I was in college and studied Dante. I took the same Dante class twice, but I really wanted to read Dante in Italian, and then eventually I convinced some of my colleagues at the New Yorker that they also wanted to read Dante in Italian. And we had a class. We had an Italian class in which we studied Italian for a year, and then we actually read all of the Divine Comedy. It took us quite a few years, but we did it. But so I was studying Italian. I mean, I just really wanted to. I wanted to read Dante, and because obviously it's the most beautiful language in the world. I don't think I'll get an argument here. But anyway. I was working at the New Yorker, and the editor of the New Yorker at the time was Robert Gottlieb, and he was given a book by the artist Saul Steinberg. I don't know, I guess people know who Saul Steinberg is, who had a friend, it was a book by a friend of his named Aldo Buzzi. They had studied together in Milan in the 1930s, I think. And Bob Gottlieb he knew I was studying Italian, and so he had this book in Italian that he couldn't read. So he said, "Look, can you just look at this? And I got to say something nice to Saul." So I started reading it, and I was kind of fascinated by it. It's many Italians also have never heard of Aldo Buzzi, because it's not Aldo Buzzi, he's Aldo Buzzi. But it was a really interesting book about Italians and Russian literature. And just for the hell of it, I thought, I'm just going to translate this just for myself, because I thought I was studying Italian. I thought it would be an interesting way of looking at the language, and it was. It was just a different way of looking at Italian from the inside, basically, rather than studying all the forms and learning all the nuances or not. But anyway, so I did translate it, and I gave the book to the translation to Gottlieb just to just to see what he thought, and he published it. So that was really how I started. My second book, this is kind of the funny end of the story. Well, not the end, but the next step of the story was the second book I translated was Pasolini's Petrolio, which is a book that no one has ever read. Very few people have ever read. It was an unfinished 500-page novel. So it was from one thing to the other.
Which is really interesting, and actually that kind of gets to my next question I wanted to ask, because, so how do you determine what the projects are that you're translating? Obviously the first one sounds like it was kind of handed to you, and it sounds like maybe there's a lot of kind of, a lot of external factors that weave into what you're deciding, but there must also be something that draws you to some of them as well.
Well, in the beginning I translated anything anybody gave me, because I just was so interested in it, and I liked having that work. And just to sort of answer one of your other questions, it was sort of complementary to the work that I did at the New Yorker. I mean, I was an editor and also a copy editor, but both of those jobs had to do with language, basically. And so these two jobs kind of complemented each other rather than contradicting. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to think of the task of the translator as being a kind of craftsman of language, right? That you're really working with words, which is also what authors are doing, right? Literature is is a way of creating beauty through words and communicating through words, and so that is really at the core of it. Say more about your approach to like the words as a translator.
Well, I mean, being a translator is literally about words, because you're constantly looking up words or thinking about words in the same way that you are as a copy editor in a sense. But it's a little different in translation, obviously. But you're constantly thinking about the meaning of a word in a sentence, the meaning of a word itself, the meaning of a word in a sentence, the meaning of the sentence in the paragraph. And you have to consider all these things, and you might, sometimes you'll be, trying to think of what is the best translation of this word, thinking of all the different nuances or the different words that could mean this, that it could mean, and, so then you think, oh my God, this here, I've got the perfect word. Then you put it in a sentence, and it just doesn't work. So it's just, it's a constant balancing of words, sentences, paragraphs, and then whole books.
Yeah, so you have to think of it at all these different levels
Exactly.
kind of simultaneously.
Yeah. And again, just the nuances of every word. Which nuance are you going to make more important?
So which is a choice, right? And so how do you balance sort of the task of being faithful to the original author, right, or to the original text, whatever that means, with the fact that you have your own voice and you're making your own choice, and bringing it into a language where the words don't work together the same way?
Exactly. Well, I don't really think about it. I mean, I don't think about my voice. And I was really surprised. I mean, have been surprised when people say, oh, I can tell this is translated by you. And I'm like, how do you know? But I'm sure that's true, but I don't think of it that way. I think of that I'm the voice of that author, of whatever author I'm translating. In the case of Ferrante, of course, it became kind of literal. When people said, well, people want to have a person attached to things. And I was I was really surprised that anybody wanted to talk to me, because the translator's invisible, like the editor or the copy editor. It was a perfect rule.
But instead you ended up being the spot.
Instead, yeah, and I thought, as you sort of were saying, I thought it was important. I agreed to do this in a sense. I mean, I sort of fell into it, but I agreed to do it because I thought it was important for translators, for a translator to become visible and important. That just made a way for people to understand that they were reading, for example, a translated work. And American publishers for a long time Europe still doesn't want to put translators' names on the covers, but in the past, many publishers didn't want to, because their idea was that if people saw that it was a translated book, they wouldn't buy it, or at least in America.
Yeah, which, I mean, it is true that in the American publishing market, we have a much lower amount of literature and translation than you find in most others, including in the British market. So it's not even a language thing, it is specific culturally. So there was a kind of reticence to mark text as translated.
Exactly, yeah. But I mean, I think that's changing a little bit. Translators are getting a little more militant. I think that Jennifer Croft refuses to translate a book unless her name's going to be on the cover. But I think it's an important stand to take.
Yeah.
I don't know, it hasn't worked with Europa.
Despite how much success you've brought them, right? I mean, come on. But no, so going back a little bit to thinking about the craft of translation and what you do as a translator, just to give people kind of a picture of what that looks like. So you've decided that you're taking on a novel, like one of Ferrante's novels, and you're going to work on it. Like, how do you start? Since there's so many different levels involved, you have the sentences and the words, you have the whole text. Like, what's the starting point? How do you begin?
Well, it depends. I mean, a lot of times I haven't read the book first, just as it sort of started as a time issue on the third Ferrante novel. The way they were published, I didn't have time to read the third one before I started working on it. So I just went with it. And I just sat down on my computer and started typing. There's a huge amount of typing involved in translation. So But, so I really just go for I just basically want to get the words on the page. So the first thing I do is make a rough draft. I just work from beginning to end, and I make a very messy first rough draft. And then I go back and I don't even try to solve big problems. And lots of times I'll put in 3 or 4 words in a place where I know I'm going to have a problem. And then I go back and I do a second draft and a third draft and a fourth draft. And I always print it out at some point, sometimes twice or 3 times. Because reading on paper is really different from reading on the screen. It's probably like everybody knows, but I actually know one translator, Czech translator, who, thanks to the great internet, the great computer situation, he prints out his translations in the format of the book, so that they look like book pages. And so that's another, sort of good way of you just need so many perspectives on everything that you're doing. I sort of mean that in a funny way, literally. You want to have different views because you see different things that are a problem, or that aren't good, or that are rough places, or that you just didn't notice before. Repetitions that are not good repetitions. That is.
I think that's such an interesting insight, because especially as we move into an increasingly digital world, right, where AI and computers are doing so much of our work, right, it's a reminder that you really do see things differently when you take it out of that sort of that space of abeyance that exists in the ethers, right, and make it concrete, and then you can interact with it differently. Yeah. Does that also kind of come a little bit from your background as an editor? And
probably. When I started working at the New Yorker, we worked on paper, only on paper. So that was a big change to start working on screen. And I think, when I left the New Yorker, which was close to 10 years ago, I can't believe it, but we still had many processes that were done on paper. I think that's already changed a lot.
Yeah, no doubt it's all continuing to change. That's really interesting. Okay, so sort of thinking a little bit more then about, you're in the process of translating, you're going through all the words, and you were telling us that in the process of translating these novels, which, your translations came out sort of a year after the publication. Right, so it's like a 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1.
Yeah.
So that, and they're large novels, right? So,
yes.
Are there things that you would do differently looking back on it?
Probably. There always are. I usually try to avoid looking at my translations once they're done, because I know I will see things that are not, that I consider, that now I would consider infelicitous, but that I thought, were okay. But for example, something that comes up with translators a lot is sometimes words just seem untranslatable, and you decide to use the Italian or whatever language, but let's say the Italian word. And in the first Neapolitan novel, the word stradone, which comes up a fair amount, and it's just of such a particular place. I tried many different versions of it, like, big street, wide street, long street, Broadway, all kinds of things. And I finally decided I would just leave it in Italian. But the other word that comes up a lot is rione. And I made that neighborhood and I left Stradone as, I defined it at the first mention and then I just kept it as Stradone. But I'm not sure I would make that decision again. I might make the opposite decision, to use the word rione. They're both words that have so much culture. They mean, and so much resonance in the novel. And so you can't make every word Italian. Because you wouldn't be doing your job.
Well, everyone can learn Italian and it'll be fine, right? But it is an interesting problem, and also, as people may have noticed on the long list of texts that Anne had translated from Ferrante, right? One of those words is actually the title of one of the books, right? The frantumaria.
Frantumaria, yeah. Yeah. I don't think, I can't remember how that worked. I think it was just that it was clear that there wasn't really a definition of frantumaria except one that took many words in English. It's defined later in the book. In the essay that's called, or so-called essay that's called Fantomalia. But yeah, I mean, it was like Petrolio. It was another one that just, oil just didn't seem like a very catchy title. Although, I don't know.
But I think that's a really interesting point too, right? Calling it a catchy title, there is something, we can think about translating words as translating meanings, but you're also translating sounds and all these other dimensions that are a little bit harder to put your thumb on, so to speak, but that are really important. I mean, how do you determine when a word sounds right?
Well, it's just you're dependent on the ear in your head, basically, or you're actually, or you can sometimes. I don't read translations. A lot of translators read out loud. I don't usually do that, but I feel like I'm reading out loud because I'm reading in my head all the time. But sometimes I read out loud just when I really feel stuck and I feel like I need to hear it out loud. But sound is crucial. Another thing that at one point I did an analysis with some sentences in Primo Levi of how the translation worked. And I was really surprised because when I went back to do this, to discover that that instinct plays a huge role. And you don't even know why you're making certain decisions, or at least you can't recreate it. So there are a lot of things that go into it. Lots of times when I'm stuck, I just walk around the house. There's a certain amount of that involved.
Movement to get your kind of brain working in a different way.
It works. I mean, sometimes, it just comes, the right word comes to you.
Yeah, that you have to give your sort of subconscious mind, in a way, a chance to sort of stop you from overthinking and let you kind of bring the words out. So would you say that your approach to translation then has evolved? I mean, can you say how that would be, or does it kind of change each time?
Well, yeah, it changes each time with each author, I think. But it definitely has evolved. I think I was much more, I hesitate to say it, but I would say a more literal translator when I started out, because I was anxious about getting things right. I'm still anxious about getting things right, but I think that I'm definitely more free. And my friend and colleague Jenny McPhee talks about when she translated Elsa Morante's Lies and Sorcery, Menzogne e Sortileggio, which is a huge book. But she said that she Slave Oak, she thought it was done, and the editor looked at it and said, this is not good. And she just went back and basically rewrote it in a much freer way, and I think it was more successsul.
Yeah, maybe that literal translation, or more literal translation.
She's not even that literal a translation.
Yeah, but there is a lot of balance there. You brought up a word in thinking about that I think is interesting and important, which is the question of responsibility. Do you feel like you have a responsibility to the author's voice? What is the kind of ethical dimension of that and what you're doing?
Well, I totally think that you have a responsibility to the author's voice, but the question is really, how do you get there? What is the author's voice? There's the sort of classic dilemma of, if you translated something, let's say the author was doing something strange syntactically, but if you did a similar strange thing in English, people would say, oh, it's a bad translation. So you have to be really, it's kind of a balancing act, I guess, to get the author's voice. And I do feel that for me, staying close to the text, also a lot of translators on their second or third round will just not look at the English. Not look at the Italian. I hope they're looking at the English, but I actually tend to keep looking at the Italian over and over again. And because also you understand it better the more you read it. You've read the book at least 4 times by the time you're done, probably more, but reading different, a paragraph or a passage, things change. Your understanding of it changes. And all of this has to do with being responsible to the author's voice and to the author's meaning.
Yeah.
You don't know what you're guessing a lot, but especially with someone like Ferrante, who's not there.
Yeah.
And I've translated a lot of dead writers.
Yeah. Who definitely are not going to respond.
No, right, exactly.
Of course, it's interesting. I was thinking about what you were saying there in your answer, and in one of Ferrante's letters. Actually, I think it's right at the beginning of Frantumaglia, where she's writing to her Italian language publishers and talking about her first novel, which is going to be turned into a film adaptation in Italy at that point, and she's talking to her publishers about that. And she makes this kind of comment because I think they're asking her to be more involved, or they're asking her how involved she can be in promoting her book, right? And her answer is, well, not at all. And she says, but it doesn't matter, because if the book's any good, it's independent of me, and you don't need me there. And so there's this interesting aspect of Ferrante of sort of saying, well, it's not about me. And does that free you up in some way as a translator, or I don't know?
No, I don't think so. I mean, in a funny way, it makes you even more tied to the text, because the text is the writer. There's no literal person. I mean, there's no, I have this sort of creature in my mind that I think of as, or creature of creation in my mind, really, that I think of as Ferrante. But it's really just made up from her characters. I mean, and also, of course, she's always a first person narrator, and that always helps you be more identified with what you're doing, at least for me, it does.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, there's also this sense in which the author, the author stands in a way in our minds for the text, but really it's the text that is the thing we're reading, right?
Exactly.
We're not reading Ferrante, we're not reading Calvino, right? Those people who live, we're reading their text that they created, and that's how we think of those people, is through their text.
Through the text, yeah.
Sometimes the people actually don't correspond to their text at all, right? We have those examples where you're like, that person wrote this.
Right, yeah. Right, well, Ferrante didn't want that to happen. Yes.
There's no risk
in
her case, yeah. So how would you describe the voice of her writing in the Neapolitan novels, and how did you kind of come to discover it, and how did you replicate it? I mean, it's a complicated thing, kind of what she does in her prose.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think I would say that mainly first of all, I mean, I had translated already 3 of her books, but this was obviously going to be different. I've never really read the 4 books through. I mean, I've read each book many times, but they weren't written when I started translating them. The first one was written, and then the second one. I think she knew what she was going to do. She had an idea, because she originally thought she was going to publish this 1,500-page or 2,000-page novel, and the editors were like, no, can't do that. Anyway, so I think that by what I've sort of been describing is by staying close to the text, by trying to capture her syntax, the sort of famous run-on sentences in English they're not so great, but I tried to hold on to them as much as I could, and really, I guess, just to stay with what to stay close to it without, and sometimes, when you're translating, you think, oh yeah, this is what she means, and you sort of go too far, and then you have to go back. But it's all a kind of, as I say, it's a balancing act of words and sentences and meanings, and tone.
Yeah, and capturing all of that is really, I mean, I think in your translations, which are really very beautiful, I'm sure you hear that all the time, but...
you can't hear too many times.
There's something really interesting about the way that you do, as you just described, maintain structures that feel sometimes a little bit Italian, and which I think that there was an era in translation when maybe people would have been told, well, you can't do that. It has to sound native English, otherwise people are going to reject it because it doesn't sound right. But this kind of like foreignizing element of it, do you feel like that actually gives it, and does that give the American reader more of a sense that this is an Italian text? Is there some draw to that maybe?
I think so. I mean, and I think that the reader you shouldn't forget that you're reading an Italian text. I mean, you should know that. It doesn't have to be, it shouldn't, I mean, there's this whole thing of the invisible translator. I mean, which again, it's like you want to be invisible, but you also want the reader to know that you're not reading Elena Ferrante's literal words, but you're reading some kind of representation that is as close as possible as you can get to reading her words without reading them in Italian.
Yeah, which
If
makes
that makes sense.
no, yeah, and it makes reading a translation, in a way, it's an opportunity for the reader to discover this other world, but to realize, to keep in mind that it is another world. It's not your own world.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and having it. So another element that I think maybe is part of that is thinking about like the presence of dialect, which is kind of complicated in Ferrante in the sense that she sometimes refers to it but doesn't actually use it. Like, how do you, capture some of those elements? Or
Well, I mean, I think that I try to just usually dialect is used in a conversation, obviously, and it's used, it's kind of an intimate language. And so I think that sometimes I would try to be a little more free with, less, let's say, less grammatical, a little more colloquial. That's really, otherwise I don't know how else to deal with dialect, or even when there is dialect. It's really hard to, it's hard to come up with a way of making it sound natural in a language that doesn't have dialect. English has accents, but it doesn't really have dialects. I mean, I once listened to this BBC show of the radio show of the Neapolitan Alps. I didn't listen to the whole thing because they used, they had the dialect was done in like some Liverpool dialect, and it just sounded ridiculous. So it just doesn't work.
Well, yeah, because it doesn't mean the same thing in a different cultural context,
yes,
right?
That's you're right. Yeah.
An Italian listening to somebody speaking in a Neapolitan dialect or whatever dialect, it has a kind of tradition and a history that's just not going to be the same.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and it just sounds silly.
It sounds forced in some way, like you're trying to do this thing that's not natural, which is so natural in the Italian case, where it's so built into the way people talk, as you said, in an intimate setting, right?
And in the maybe everybody knows this, but in the film version, the actors did speak in dialect, and in Italy they had subtitles in Italian.
Right, which is actually fairly common, right? When there's a sort of dialect-heavy production, you get subtitles in Italian. Which is, again, just something that doesn't match experience here in the United States, or presumably even in the UK. I don't think they ever use subtitles for their different regional dialects. So you spent so much time working on these translations of Ferrante. You became, in a way, the representative of Ferrante, but you also have spent simultaneously, in many cases, so much time working on translating other authors. And I want to ask a little bit about how you balance that. So, for example, as you were mentioning, the sort of 10-year plus process of putting together the complete works of Primo Levi, which came out around the same time as, I guess, the last...
2015.
The last of the 4 Neapolitan novels. So you're also dealing with the voices and the texts of these very different authors from different times, with a different kind of purpose, a different style, different language. How do you kind of balance all of that? How does it all live in your head?
Well, my theory is that all the different things help each other, that they sort of, they feed on each other, they complement each other. You find a word in a different context in a different writer, and it suddenly illuminates the word in the other writer. And I mean that doesn't happen all the time, but definitely I think that's works in my brain all the time, where it's working in my brain of thinking of words in Italian, or remembering, sentences are going on in my head, or maybe not whole sentences, but let's say phrases are going on in my head, and suddenly there it is in another author. And I think so my theory is that that's all helpful to each translation. It just is illuminating, because I didn't grow up speaking Italian. You just know more about your language if you grow up speaking it. So I'm trying to compensate.
So you mentioned earlier kind of spending a lot of time looking up words, right? So sort of dictionaries and those sorts of tools. what other tools do you use as you're kind of navigating these different linguistic worlds?
Well, dictionaries. The internet is incredibly helpful, and I have to admit that I do use, I look things, the ChatGPT or AI functions are really useful for looking things up. They have, for example, you can look up dialect. And that's really, there are dialect dictionaries online, I use those, but when I'm really stuck, I try AI, it's not always successful. And of course you have to be careful, because it's not always correct, but that's a helpful tool. I still use books, look things up in books, I ask people.
Yeah, that was what I was going to ask you,
Yeah.
is whether there's like a conversational aspect. And obviously you're not talking to Elena Ferrante
No.
about what she means.
No.
But
with other authors, with authors that are available, I often will ask them, about words, particular words. About some things. Actually, Aldo Guzzi was really a very difficult person to work with, because he knew some English, but he thought he knew a lot of English. And he would be constantly trying to change everything. He was also rewriting at the same time, which was all.
That's interesting.
He was a great man.
And so he would, so you were...
I went to Milan to work with him, and we would be sitting there, and he'd say, no, or, this isn't right, or whatever. Anyway, and I knew it was right.
But you had to, so did you find that you had to kind of defer to him as the author then?
No, I don't think I did in the end very often. Maybe once or twice when I was too exasperated to keep arguing. But,
So you said that you were in Milan with him there, which is, I think, interesting. That was another question I wanted to ask. Did you spend time in Naples as part of this whole process?
No, I didn't. I had been to Naples. I had spent some time in Naples, actually more in the 80s and early 90s. But, and then I went back, but I didn't go not for any particular reason, but I just wasn't able to go there when I was working on the Neapolitan novels, which is a little crazy. But I did have I had a sense of Naples. I hadn't been to the actual Rione, but I had been in Naples, and I sort of understood a little bit about the geography and the places. I had a sense, but I didn't go.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to what you're saying, that the world that you're translating is the world that's in the words of the text, right?
Yeah.
In a way, you're not going to bring your own vision of Naples into it anyway.
I think it's helpful. One of the things that, among the many things that are difficult in translation is describing places that you haven't seen. And so it is helpful if you have seen the place. Not that you're going to describe it in your own words, but you have a sense of what the author's getting at, because geographical words, landscape words, can be very ambiguous, and so they're hard to figure out sometimes. That's one of the many things in the list of things that are hard about translation.
So in that kind of, you were saying that in some cases you're able to actually speak to the translator who's living, who you collaborate with in some ways. Another interesting case there is you translated one of the works of Jhumpa Lahiri, who is, I think, really fascinating because, of course, she's not a native Italian speaker, but is writing in Italian and then having someone else translate into a native that into a language that she's already fluent in. And so, what was that process like?
It was very stressful. First I couldn't, when I was asked to do it, I was sort of suspicious, and I was like, why would she want someone else to translate her book? And it was explained to me that she felt, and I think this was a legitimate fear, that she didn't want to rewrite the book. And she thought if she was translating it, she would just be rewriting it. And I think that's a real possibility. But, so I did do it. It's an interesting book because it's about learning Italian. And so it progresses from sort of simple to the Italian gets a little more complicated at the end. Anyway, we both were a little bit uncomfortable, but we did sit down. She had a list of things she wanted changed, and almost all those things were just a different word choice. Like where I had chosen one meaning, she just decided she thought it was better as another meaning, or a meaning with a different nuance. And so that was really the only disagreement we had. I mean, but then she went on to translate her own works, and then she went on not to translate her own works again. She did it with, I think her book of Roman stories is translated, one of them was translated with someone else, with another translator called Todd Flores. Yeah, so it was tricky.
Yeah.
Because as I'm not Elena Ferrante, I'm not Jhumpa Lahiri, and I couldn't imagine myself writing like Jhumpa Lahiri. So,
but you don't have to. I mean, it's a really interesting thing, right? To be a translator is to have this opportunity in a way to put on so many different masks.
Well, one of my favorite, sort of translator analogies is the actor. Is that the translator is a performer, some sort of actor or maybe musician, and you're interpreting the text or the text in your own way. I mean, you become that text, that character, that role, and it's different for every translator, and for every text.
Yeah, exactly. For every text. Yeah, that's really.
You're playing a different character.
You're the actor taking on all these different roles. Yeah. So I want to kind of I want to make sure we have time for people to ask you questions. So maybe we'll kind of close here with a question. My kind of last question for you, which is sort of a little bit holistic, as it were, right? You've done all this work translating so many of Ferrante's novels, translating so many other people's voices, kind of taking on all these different roles as an actor, as you're describing it. Do you sort of see yourself now as a translator, and are you going to continue kind of like, do you have more projects coming up? Do you have more ideas of where you want to go? What's your kind of direction?
My direction is where people are asking me to translate books. No, I mean, almost every book that I've done has been, this is an earlier question, because a publisher or someone asked me to translate it, or asked if I wanted to translate it. And I've almost, in the beginning, as I said, I did whatever anybody asked me, including the Pope. I did little known parenthesis in my career. But
when you translated something for the Pope?
Yeah. Yes, the Polish Pope. The Polish Pope.
Oh.
Yeah, so it was Polish, then it was Italian, and then it was English. Those books were not as successful as the publisher thought they would be. I think they imagined them as being, they were like sayings of the Pope. And the publisher imagined that they'd be like, at the checkout counter, and people would just pick them up. But it didn't work out. Anyway, so I've had a pretty varied career. And again, even those books, they add something to your store of knowledge in both a cultural way and a linguistic way. And even books that you translate that turn out to be uncongenial, you always learn something, even if you didn't, if it was kind of torture. But I guess I didn't answer your question.
So there's more to learn.
Anyway, there's more to learn.
That's wonderful.
So I'm just going to keep on doing it.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic, because that means we have a lot more that we're going to be able to keep on reading, and you've done such an amazing service for us all as readers to make all of these different voices available. So there's much to celebrate and look forward to. Like I said, I want to make sure now that there's time for people to ask questions, because I'm sure that you guys have things that you're curious about as well. So let's open up the floor.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much for being here. I want to ask a question to Ann Goldstein, the reader, then the translator. Since you've been immersed in Ferrante's world, right, so from the inside, and I wanted to ask you if you have, she explores very much the female psyche, right, if she goes really deep into the interiority of these women, also in very disturbing places. So I was wondering if you have a favorite character, female character in Ferrante's, because, there is a little bit of difference from the very first novels. They're also in style, they're so compact and strong, they really slap in your face. And then you go to these expansive characters in the quartet. I was just wondering if you had, being so much from the inside of translating this world, this female universe, if you had a favorite female character.
Well, in some ways, of course, it's Olga in the Days of Abandonment, but in other ways, it's Lenu. So,
Yeah.
well, between those two,
Yeah.
sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other. I mean, Lenu, the Neapolitan novels are really like, basically, they're sort of my life as well as her life. I mean, it's the same period of time. Of course, I wasn't in Italy or Naples, but it's globally the same period of time, living through the same experiences of being a woman, I think. So, you know, it's hard not to feel a kind of identification, not an identification, but closeness to that character.
Thank you for your wonderful work. Way over here.
Oh,
How did you communicate with Ferrante? Was it via email? And was it in Italian or in English? Or
In
did you
Italian.
speak at all?
I don't, I've never spoken to her. And the times that I've asked questions, I write to the publisher and the publisher writes to her.
I see. In Italiano?
In
probably.
Italiano,
Yeah.
sì. Yeah, yeah.
I have two questions. The first question is, when you read and translated Ferrante, did you ever, who would you say influenced her for writing? Did you ever think about, was there other authors, Italian or otherwise, who influenced her? And my second question is more personal. When you translate, do the authors you're translating, do they ever come to you in your dreams?
Not the author so much, but the characters definitely. When I came to the end of the Neapolitan characters, the Neapolitan quartet, I remember feeling like my head was empty. And I was like, where are those people? So, yeah, they do, in that way. Wait, what was the other question? The influences of, well, if you read In the Margins, this book it's really the last book she published, I guess. Oh, it's not up here. It was up here earlier. She talks a lot about the books that have influenced her, but I think that, you know, Ferrante, definitely, Albert Cespedes, she talks about them in Francomalia. She talks about some of the other ones, I don't know, maybe remember some of them. But In the Margins, and some feminist writers. So I would recommend reading that book. It's really interesting. It's about her origins as a writer.
Thank you. This is a technical question. So you're the ultimate arbiter of the translation, but then do you have an editor of your English translation?
Yes, and that varies greatly. Some editors are very, they have a lot to say. And some have nothing to say. And it's nice to have an editor who's got a good balance of that. And actually, although Europa Editions doesn't put the translator's name on the cover, they do something that no American publisher does, which is that they have someone read the translation who knows both languages, and so is checking the translation, and that is such a gift.
But it was a different editor for each book, which I find interesting.
Lately, it's been the same editor.
Oh, good.
Yeah, Europa, yeah, but it depends on the publisher.
Thank you.
I was very interesting when you said that when you translate to English, you want the reader to understand that it's an Italian sentence, so you try to have the sentence remind that. So I was thinking, how do you define a well done? How do you measure a well done translation? Like, is it like what do you pursue? Like being as close to possible to what Elena Ferrante was thinking, or being as close to possible to what the American reader should, like the effect that you want to have in the American reader, or what else? Like,
Yeah, I don't really. I mean, someone asked me this question recently, about the reader. I realized that I don't really think about the reader. I mean, I think about myself as a reader. So I think that I'm more trying to be the author that I'm translating, rather than to be a friendly voice to the reader, to the American reader. Of course, I want the American reader, to read something that they want to read. but I don't really think about it as something that they should read, and that should be easy for them necessarily. In other words, Ferrante, this is my goal, is, and she's a good example because of her particular style. It should be it has to be readable in English, but I try to keep the certain kind of that certain run-on quality. And you can do it to a certain extent, just not as much. But that's one example, sort of concrete example.
I'm curious about titles, particularly the title of the first volume in the quartet, and the choice to use My Brilliant Friend for the title.
Sounded better. We went back and forth a lot about brilliant, what word about the geniale. But I think once we decided on brilliant, it just seemed like the brilliant friend sounded a little cold. Maybe.
So I think in addition to having to translate the words, you also have to be sort of a cultural ambassador.
Right.
And part of that is also having an understanding of what the reader's familiarity is with Italian culture. Do you think that that's evolved since when you first started doing translations to today?
Definitely. I think definitely there's a lot of things you don't have to explain anymore. I don't know. Phyllis used to say macaroni rather than pasta. So that's just a silly example, but I think things have evolved a lot, and it's hard to know. At the New Yorker, we used to have this funny example of the New Yorker is very explanatory, as I'm sure you all know. I mean, we want to make sure everything's clear, but we used to say God, Judeo-Christian deity. That was an example of over. Try not to do that. But you don't always know.
There's that question?
I was just wondering if tenses, I tempi, play a part in your. Obviously they do, but I've just learned that passato remoto is often used by writers even when they're only just talking about something last week. It's sort of a stylistic thing. So we wouldn't get that in a translation.
No.
You would just use the past tense, conjuntivo and perfecto, all of these different tenses. How do you deal with those?
Well, that's verbs are actually really interesting and tricky case. I mean, the tenses, I think you just I have to usually just use whatever tense seems natural in English. I mean, like a lot of times things are in the, anyway, the had, the perfect. And in Italian, Italians use the perfect much more than English does. And so, you can't, I often will eliminate it. Another thing is, of course, Italian verbs contain their subjects. And that's always like a difficulty, causes trouble. And there are other things that make Italian a lot more flexible than English. So there are sort of constraints built in.
This may be a dumb question, but do you ever find yourself translating from English literature to friends, colleagues in Italian? And is it the same thought process, or what does it feel like when you're trying to explain something literary in Italian?
Oh, well, of course, it's very complicated. I would never translate English to Italian. I mean, I write letters and stuff, emails, but I would never try to write a translation the other direction. It just would be too I just wouldn't know enough.
I'm a researcher on AI governance, so I have two reflections and a question for you. So your career started because somebody wanted a translation, right? As
No,
a translator.
I started because I just translated it.
Perfect. So the second one, in academia, we call you a co-author, not translator, because you write that book, right? You look at it, you look at somebody's work, and you try to make sense of it. In an academia, you should get awarded, you should get recognition. So that's my second reflection. And my third one is moving forward, now with the AI, and of course, we're here in Silicon Valley. How do you see people who come after you on what is it your role or role of individuals who are doing your work in a moment where technology can do so much?
Well, technology can't make a literary translation. So I think there's always going to be a need for literary translators. I mean, I think even publishers will probably recognize that. I think that, you know, we were talking about this yesterday, translators, technological translators, or you know, legal translators, medical translators, they may have some trouble. But I think that literary translators are always going to be needed because AI can't make those decisions.
Yeah, I think that goes back to what you were saying earlier, right? This idea of there's a kind of a responsibility. You become an ambassador for a different culture, but you also are making choices, and you need a kind of an embodied human there that's going to make those choices for a reason that speaks to an audience.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm glad to hear that you're going to be here doing more translations for the future, and that there's going to be an opportunity for all of you to continue reading Ann Goldstein's amazing translations. So hopefully for many years to come. Thank you so much for sharing all of the details. Thank you all for being here.
Facciamo una foto?